Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on Thinking Outside the Sink. Just before we start, I've got three things to tell. First, and probably the most important, is that we're so grateful for Black Hat conference organizers for actually giving us opportunity to speak here today. And thank all of you for actually showing up. Also, thank you for everybody who's watching online. Next thing I want to talk about is the structure of our presentation. You probably want to make sure we're going to talk about things you expect us to talk about. So first, I'm going to give an introduction how Patrick and I met. How did we, decide to work on this project? And I'm going to give it to Patrick. Patrick is going to talk about the algorithm that our project uses. Then I'm going to shortly come back with my technical part. And we are also going to wrap the conclusions. We're going to discuss the CVEs we have rediscovered using our approach. And that is going to be it. That's the plan for the next 30 minutes. So with that, the third thing I want to tell is actually the story how Patrick and I met. And it's really interesting because we come from the same high school. I graduated high school 1 year ago, and Patrick is currently a freshman in the high school. And our computer science teacher introduced us. He texted me approximately 8 months ago and asked if I want to participate in a project that his student has. And back then, I didn't expect that the project would be so interesting, that I would learn so much from it, and that the project is eventually going to end up on a Black Hat. Moreover, I didn't expect to meet such a wonderful vulnerability researcher as Patrick, and it was really a pleasure to work with him. So with that, I'm going to give it to Patrick, and Patrick is going to talk about the algorithmic part of our solution.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thanks for Sasha for telling our story. When our teacher introduced us, I thought I was just getting a mentor as Sasha, but I didn't realize I was also getting his unfinished high school homework. But anyways, so hey folks, my name is Ray Kai. I'm a 16-year-old founder and researcher. I founded Pauno, and I also do low-level security research. And now I'm going to tell you about how I came up with this algorithm part of our research before Sasha came back on how the results. So the story of Tree-of-AST starts with a paper I read about in summer. Tree-of-Thoughts, delivering problem solving with large language models. This is a reasoning framework proposed by Google DeepMind, built upon a famous chain of thought framework that's used deeply in reasoning models nowadays, like models like DeepSeek, GPT, or Cloud, you can name it. The reason why I specifically love Tree-of-Thoughts, and the reason why I was immediately intrigued, and the reason why I just love reading this paper, as you can see all the annotations on it, is because rather than a pure generative framework, Tree-of-Thoughts is more like a cognitive thinking and reasoning system. They introduce trees as a way to give a holistic human thinking derived from ourselves, from the linear single pass reasoning to the sophisticated linear deduction. In this stateful framework, Tree-of-Thought introduced techniques based on voting, value, look ahead, and backtracing we'll dive right into just in a second. LLMs are not only able to think in a straight line, but in colorful ways. So if you're not familiar with Tree-of-Thoughts, the best way for me to introduce is via one example. One of the most straightforward instances that Google DeepMind used to introduce Tree-of-Thought is through a game that we all knew of, the game of 24. In this game, you're given 4 numbers with operation tools that you are familiar with since primary school, plus, minus, multiplication, and division to construct a statement that equals to 24. As easy as the task might seem, there are actually a lot of complexity and challenge hidden beneath it. For the record, I wasn't good at this game at all. My friends will always beat me in this game. Didn't really figure that out like back then. But then I realized first, you will have to strategically pick a good pair of number and a way to approach for 24. For example, you can try multiplication and division, create a huge number at first, and divide it into something like 24. Or addition and multiplication, we're trying to compose 2 factors of 24. Or trickier or easier ones where it simply adds up every single number, or even getting decimals involved. And this immense space of combination and its dependency on early decision made it extremely hard for AI. And honestly, I think this is even harder for AI comparing to us. Chain of thought models are essentially not token prediction machine. They generate based upon previous output and context. So here's the results. So now you might be wondering, how can a generative approach be a game changer, be taintless? As you can see on the title of this slide, it doesn't add up. Doesn't make sense, right? How are these even connected at all? And to explain that, we will have to jump right into another story, but in a fun way. So back in the summer of 2024, I was working on a security research program at Hunter. If you're not familiar with them, they're open source bug hunting platform for ML projects like Transformers, Dataflow. You sort of find these vulnerabilities or bug in these popularly used ML projects, then report into maintainer to sort of prevent these like catastrophic supply chain attacks. Despite we're in the new era of vibe coding, this was not specifically a tree of low-hanging fruits. So the first reason is you have to deal with these whole huge, massive code base size and these complex symbolic relationship. Many Python ML projects are previous C++ developer, so you can sort of see these confusing usage, template class, Marco, things like that. Researching such project is not an easy task at all. It's sort of like finding a drop of water in the ocean. At the meantime, it's also pretty competitive. As you can see, I submitted 51 reports, only 18 of them got a CVE. So it's not only about the complexity and the code base size, but also the competition that made it extremely a challenging project. However, during that period of intense research, a specific methodology came intuitive to our use. This specific research methodology caused search to sync analyze under the world of taint analysis save us ton of time and efforts by providing us of natural analytical advantage and efficiency. Sort of just like how we develop a way that we use intuitively for the game of 24. And also connected to something that's simply 1,000 miles away, tree-of-AST reasoning. So, if you don't know about taint analysis, here's a really fun example. I'm not sure if you ever played the game Where's My Water by Disney before, but I just think this is a fantastic way to tell about taint analysis. So in this game, you had a source, the cloud, where the water came from. In our world, that's your data input. This can be endpoint, RG file input, whatever input. This water then goes through complex pipeline. In our case, in real world, it's your program where data projects data flow. It can be both clean or poisonous. However, eventually it reaches to the sink. We're in this graph where a little crocodile friend takes his bath. So this whole concept of poisonous water and crocodile is such important for us in real life security research because first of all, the existence of dangerous function doesn't take account for the provability of reachability and the exploitability of the vulnerability. And secondly, the existence of this poisonous data input doesn't mean it's necessarily going to reach for the sink. And the only way for us to tell if a vulnerability is exploitable and reachable is through what we call data flow analyze, where the source connectivity to the sink is proven by consideration of sanitizer. So quick sum up from now. Sink are where the source meets. The source are the inputs of data. With both of them existing and connecting, boom, pretty much you have a vulnerability. So in the concept and the world of taint analysis, we usually say source to sink, like in fuzzing or symbolic execution. But as we mentioned previously, if you approach it upside down as sink to source, it's actually much more simpler. When we choose sinks that root and diffuse outward to control we got a tainted graph, then examining the source to sink connectivity to prove exploitability, it's just naturally easier. And but why? Just actually a lot of philosophical reasoning behind. So first of all, it's way too easy to identify sinks. They're very literal and they're cacheable by tools like AST or regex. And second is about the false positive and low severity. Usually source using the execution approach means ton of false positive or non-valuable vulnerability. However, if you directly approach it by these high priority sink, and if you can backtrace them to any source, it guarantees the severity that worth the effort of the sink. And the third one, my personally favorite one, is what I call context relevance. Now, this might sound new because it's a new world and it's also a bit counterintuitive, but it's actually much more simpler. Since we started as the sink, we actually deduct backward to which the data might flows into. And in fact, what this means is the sink have huge potential cosine and parameter context. We're inherited by its color patterns. Thus, this is essentially a task of recovering the path to source. And this specific trait of it helps us deliberately handle this complexity of conditional edges and ignore the classic passive Bayesian problem. But it might leave a little question for sanitizer, but we'll dive right into that for a minute. So now you might have another super interesting question. How does all that we have said have anything to do with tree-of-AST? And the answer lies in the statefulness and what they have in common of what we call the pruning process. So what do I mean by pruning? Look at the tree diagram. The top one shows the tree of thought in action. The bottom one shows sink to source in action. The similarity of them exists in where both of them, you start with one specific node. Then you choose a node where you pin down the rest of the node, similar to how your garden cut down like branches of your tree, to elect one specific node that's most possibly leading to your targets. In other words, we cut out these unrelated wild low value branches to focus on finding the biggest fruit. And in this process, we elect the next node based on current one, and each nodes are built upon past one, and this is what we call statefulness. And with these two similar property and aspects of the task, what is fun is that taint analysis seems like the specific task a traditional reasoning model will fail at, and what Tree-of-AST will excel at. In other words, sync to source is actually the game of 24 for taint analysis. So this is what I summarize as state recovery task. So in other words, where both of states are not only given the context of previous statefulness, but also the future statefulness. And this is essentially a task of recovering future using both the future and the previous contextual information. And what is funny about that is you will sort of start to see that Tree-of-AST is actually better than this task, comparing even with the OG Tree-of-AST. Because first of all, we don't have to generate potential states. We already have them as graph, and all we need to do is choose between them. And the context relevance that we mentioned previously give us even more contextual association about the next state. So all of these combined allow us to take an enhanced reasoning framework, Tree-of-AST, based on the next token prediction machine transformer to apply it deliberately to a repetitive path of search in taint analysis, connecting these two seemingly 1,000 miles away systems together. And here is where we introduce the idea of Tree-of-AST. So as we mentioned previously, we first going to build a taint graph based on the sinks. We diffuse our from the sink function to see because how easy these sinks are easy to find. Inspired by Tree-of-AST paper, we start as the ruler and we traverse to source through voting while incorporating with value, which are potential depths of states as a weighted score. And by that, we also implement a look ahead, sort of like the techniques you use in transformers thinking, but for us, we directly review the next conclusive states. And with that voting process, we first vote on certain node to determine which one of the next parallel nodes appears most possibly leading to the source. And based on that elected node, you continuously vote upon them, while for each step, you also vote if the current node are the source node or not. And if we need to backtrace, as we mentioned, Tree-of-AST is essentially a stateful task. We can easily rewind back to one of the states that we've been through until at the end, we determine whether we reach the sink or we just technically can't. Thus, electing ourselves with set of state that interconnects from the sink to the source. But wait, as we mentioned in the title, Tree-of-AST doesn't stop at vulnerability discovery. They go all the way to payload generation. And that is another ingenious part that I love so much about Tree-of-AST. Using our elected sink to source path, we reverse the journey. We traverse source to sink, generating nested constriction tasks that describe the previous generated sink to source chain. But reversely, from the symbolic execution point of view, filling the gaps that we have skipped, handling the restriction and condition to make up for the semantic that we deliberately ignored in our first pass. However, this time without any traditional path explosion problem. Since we have limited us to such a puny and limited slice of program by Tree-of-AST. And with these generated constraints, we reverse traverse source to sink again from top to bottom, but this time with the intent of multi-generation by this simplified SMT solver logic. Gradually fitting the final payload by these constriction tests by this deductive linear chain of thoughts alike generation based on this chain of states that we constructed 2 steps before. So this framework, built on Tree-of-AST, solved the data flow analyze challenge by taking both directions of how data flows. Born by bug hunting experience, weeks of brainstorming, and we have taken this massive codebase and narrowed them down systematically by voting state by state, with look ahead and value mechanisms that act like contextual suggestion, and rewinding for make up for these strategic mistakes. We then reverse traverse autonomously elected states to solve for the original path exporting problem, but in a such much more simpler way. While that way enable us to go from vulnerability discovery all the way to payload generation. And this is how we analyze 2 seemingly unconnected concepts and discover that they are actually made for each other. And that is Tree-of-AST. All right, so finish up with how we came up with the approach. Now I'm going to handle the presentation to Sasha, where he will talk about how we actually implemented.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. It was an awesome story how our algorithm works. Now I'm gonna talk about the technical side of our approach. So how do we actually implement it? And I'm gonna give a spoiler right away. I'm gonna mostly be talking about the internal program representation issue and how are we solving it. So when I was doing this part, I actually thought it would be cool if I would not only talk about the frameworks that we use and all about technicalities, but I would also talk about the experience we had using these technologies, because I think both are valuable. With that, we knew it's not going to be an easy problem to solve. We allocated quite some time for it, and we went with the most basic approach, AST. It was our initial guess how we're going to solve it. So what is an AST? For those of you who never heard of it, it's something that mostly used in compilers. So you have your Python, for example, program or C++ program. First step, it gets lexed. It turns into tokens, and tokens get parsed. So you get an AST. AST eventually, by the way, good example to represent it is if A, if B, else C statement in Python, you see it gets converted into if expression with test body or else part. So it's really easy to work with, like it's really easy to write the code for it. But yeah, AST has a lot of issues. ASTs has a lot of issues. And the first one is they're really language specific. So in order to make a successful software that discovers vulnerabilities, you actually need to support many languages. I think that's obvious. But you don't want to rewrite your whole software every time you want to adapt a new language. So ASTs are not the best fit in terms of being language universal. Next, cross-file analysis. ASTs work specifically with one file. So if you have a project which consists of many files, most projects are, you need to correlate calls between files together, correlate files themselves together, and that takes a lot of work as well. Scope resolution. Scope resolution is another issue which I'm going to talk about later. I have a separate slide for it, so I'll not forget. And the import handling and complexity versus benefit issues, they are coming from the top 3 issues on the slide. So import handling is related with cross-file analysis, and complexity versus benefit, well, it's all of them put together. So after resolving imports with ASTs and doing topological sorts, we definitely understood that maybe we're doing something wrong, because it shouldn't be as complex and it's not supposed to be as hard to make it work. And we're like, maybe there's a ready solution, so we don't have to do it. Yeah, there is. So there is a framework called StackGraphs. Framework is developed by a GitHub team. And what it allows you to do is it enables precise code navigation and symbols resolution. A simple way to think about StackGraphs is opening a repository in GitHub. So if you open a Python repository, it will actually show you, like, there is a function, you click on it, and it shows you, this function is defined in this file on this line, and it is used in this file on that line. It is intuitive, but what happens if you open C++ repository on GitHub and try to click on a function? Well, nothing is going to happen. StackGraphs don't support C++. So that's something I'm going to talk about later as well. Now, let's come back, as I promised, to symbol resolution. Symbol resolution can be described in a very simple way. I think I took this example from the official documentation. So imagine we have a function. Function is defined in some file, imported to the other file, then imported to another file, and used this way. How do we know which function are we using if there are two functions with the same name? This is the question that we asked. It relates not only to functions, but also to variables. And so the symbol resolution problem is actually a really hard one to solve. Thankfully, StackGraphs do this for us. So we were like, cool, we found a promising framework. We just need to make it work, right? It already does everything for us, not much work, supposedly we should do. Before that, I'm going to talk about StackGraphs and how they actually work. StackGraphs are based on another framework, which is called Tree-of-AST. So easy way to remember this is that StackGraphs sit on Tree-of-AST. Tree-of-AST framework builds a concrete syntax tree for a specific file, which is kind of AST, but with a lot of more information and a lot more low level. But the main thing you should know about Tree-of-AST is that it provides a universal API for querying any language. So no matter if your code is on JS or in Python, you can query the definitions using same syntax, which makes it really flexible to work with. So stack graphs use tree seeder to apply TSGs, namely language-specific rules for import resolution, name resolution, visibility resolution, all sorts of resolutions, and they eventually build a stack graph data structure, which we are working with, which we're querying. So this is a simplified version of how stack graphs work. Very interesting. But how do they work like in reality? Well, much harder as it turns out. And I don't expect you to go through this graph, but we spent so much time just figuring it out. The thing is, which we wanted to implement our own version of stack graph specifically for our task with all optimizations. And this framework itself is written on Rust. It all was happening 2 months before the Black Hat, and we're like, we have a ton of time, yes? No, we actually failed implementing it. It turned out to be too complex for 2 people. So what are we eventually using if we couldn't, code the stack graphs ourselves? Well, we actually found a ready library, which uses stack graphs. So instead of having like this whole struggle with doing AST, trying to make stack graphs work, we could just search for a library in a better way, and eventually it all simplified into us having pretty much 2 functions to work with it. So yeah, that's how we solve the internal program representation issue. Now I'm gonna talk about other things which I find really interesting, which we selected, but I couldn't make a whole separate presentation section out of it. So it's minor things that are still really important. First, I'm going to talk about the approach to taint analysis problem. People usually tend to ask a question: does the sink directly receive tainted data? And this is valid. This is absolutely valid. And most people use this approach just because of the way we're trained to think about the taint analysis problem. Because we think about it in terms of functions. We write code which involves functions. We analyze functions, so we think of this in terms of functions. This is a valid approach. I'm not saying anything, but there is an established approach which, as I will show on the next slide, outperforms the mentality of asking, does the sink directly receive tainted data? The approach is basically asking the question, can tainted data reach the sink through any path, including via calling functions? And here is the proof to that. Most of vulnerabilities can be split into 3 code patterns. They're on the slide, I'm not going to read them. And there are many ways to solve the taint analysis problem. There's argument tracking, parameter-based tainting, traditional sink trace. And most of the ways to solve taint analysis problem have miss couple of these options, except parameter-based tainting. So we use parameter-based tainting in our approach. And it also helps you avoid the amount of false positives. So, yep. Next thing, I mentioned that we found a library. Library is actually closed source. It is made by a person we don't know. The library had a bug. It was working perfectly until we hit 200 file project. When we hit 200 file project, it just freezes. How do we want to solve this problem? Because it was upsetting for us. We were making a project specifically to work with huge code bases. So we thought, if there is a sink function, functions that call it probably are close to the sink. We called it spatial locality area of the sink. Think about it. It's much more probable that the function from the same module, from the same file, will call the sink rather than the function from some unrelated piece of software. So when we analyze first 200 files from the spatial locality of the sink, we go to the next 200 files. Okay, I'm just going to briefly go over how we use LMs. Patrick talked a lot about it, but we use LMs for all sorts of stuff. We use LMs for input source detection, path selection, backtracking. We also use smarter LM models to reweight the scores for confidence scores for vulnerability to make sure we get less false positives again. And we use LangChain. LangChain is an obvious choice if we want to keep it simple but powerful. Okay, with that, I feel the time is almost over, so I'm going to jump into the results. Before we discuss promised rediscovered CVEs, I'm going to talk about how our approach is different as a Dataflow engine. And first thing, and probably the most important thing we want you to take out from the speech that is related to our project is that we actually apply human cognitive process heuristics on vulnerability analysis. So we solve the problem in a way as human would. And we solve the problem not by just sending it over to LM. So we just don't send the file to LM and ask it, is there a vulnerability? While it is valid and it can show you vulnerability, LMs tend to miss a lot of stuff. And yeah, we never send any big amounts of code base into the LM. And we also deduct dynamically. What does it mean? While I know it sounds complex, the meaning is actually quite simple. We do not process a whole program at one time. We take small pieces and we analyze them. The program or LM doesn't ever have the context about some unrelated functions. We work with one specific piece of code at a time. That helps avoid overcomputation, and as Patrick mentioned, it helps avoid the path explosion problem. Now, the CVEs we have rediscovered. Obviously, big projects. Why are we even showing this to you? So we investigated what other projects do. Other projects that also try to do the autonomous vulnerability discovery. And everybody are just listing CVEs they have found or rediscovered. So we just went with the same approach. So yeah, what issues we have faced while measuring the performance? First, we are designed specifically for large projects. And there is no single data set consisting of large projects with mapped vulnerabilities so we can compare against. As well as that, any vulnerability that is found using our approach, we need to verify manually. And it's a ton of work, and it would probably take months. So yeah, that's quite it with the results. And now I'm going to talk about the major conclusions, aka Black Hat sound bites. I'm going to go from the least general to most general. And the first takeaway I want to give is saying, if you have a cybersecurity task, any cybersecurity task, pretty much any task, which has a human work in it involved, which most tasks do, you need to separate the strategic decision part and the manual work part. Automate manual work part as much as possible using deterministic code bases and something that cannot make a mistake. And you need to delegate the strategic decision making to LMs, because with Tree of Thought framework, it is becoming really possible. Next general takeaway is that we can enhance established cybersecurity methods like AI fuzzing, static dynamic analysis with AI. And the first, most general one is, I would say, try to rethink the problems, not the problems, but the approaches that the industry has as established ones from a long ago, from zero. Because we tend to use a lot of things that were developed a long time ago and not think how they actually work. But they can be enhanced a lot if we use modern principles and technologies. So that's quite it, what we have. And Patrick, did I forget anything? Oh, good. Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Then that's it for now. Thank you.